Hey guys, welcome. We are about to dive back into the world of gods and monsters with the story of Medusa. I told the story in the previous video, so I'll link it below if you haven't seen it. Right now, we're going to talk all about symbolism and answer questions about the story, like why is Athena so mean? I thought she was supposed to be the goddess of wisdom, and what's up with the snake hair? Is Perseus really a hero? So, I'm also going to tell you what characters I think hold the most importance for us right now, and that's probably not who you think. And just know we're using an archetypal lens for this story, so every part is an aspect of one person's psyche. It's all symbolic, so we can look at where the characters show up in our own selves, including our bodies. When we go to that innermost layer first, it becomes easier to zoom out and see how the story shows up in the collective. It's going to be really deep, so let's dive right in. In the story video, I told you about Medusa's star, Algol. It's what they call a fixed star because it takes a really long time to move. It currently lies at 26 degrees Taurus, which is the sign of the bull, which represents body and instinct. And this is extremely fitting because this is very much a story of how the body instinctually responds when overwhelmed by fear. The freeze response being petrified. A lot of us find this very relevant, especially for women, because of how our biology is, and especially with complex trauma histories, we may have nervous systems that really lean toward that freeze response and the way we've been wired by past events and perhaps ancestral imprints when either a threat or even just stress or maybe pressure comes, that survival physiology takes over really quickly, and we may not have a lot of ability to mobilize before we shut down in some way. Maybe that's not being able to access our voice, or we disconnect from our bodies and go up to our heads, or maybe we get really tired and we can't seem to move toward what we wanted. There are so many ways that the freeze response can show up in us, but the result is there is a lot of frozen energy in our systems, and that takes a toll on the body, and it's really not sustainable. So keep that in mind as we go on. The story begins with Medusa serving at Athena's temple. So at this point, she is the innocent maiden. And this is from Ovid's version of the story. There is another version where she was always a Gorgon. I like this one because there's the contrast between the Gorgons who are always Gorgons and the maiden who gets turned into a Gorgon. And this has deeper meaning that we'll get into in a few minutes. Medusa, as the maiden, realizes that she is vulnerable and she's getting a lot of attention, and that feels unsafe. The hair is an aspect here, and that's in the original version from Ovid, where her hair is the most striking thing about her. And for our purposes, that could represent like that what's coming out of her head, her own authentic expression, is part of what makes her vulnerable. And I think that's something a lot of us can relate to, right? Because especially as little ones, you start to learn that you need to make yourself fit in and be, smart, but not too smart, and not shine too brightly. Perhaps for many of us, the message was we couldn't just exist in the world as we were authentically. The temple seems like the safest place for Medusa to be. Where do we go when it doesn't feel safe to be present? For a lot of us, we escape to the safety of the mind. And when there's a long-term sense that the world is not safe for me, we might try to calm ourselves and create structure, not just through perhaps fantasy and imagination, which can be part of it too, but also creating structure through meaning making, beliefs, and rituals. So basically temples, right? In many ways, that is a necessity of being human, right? We need to make sense of life and create some order. It just gets unbalanced when we permanently escape to these temples of thoughts while we're overriding the body's wisdom and suppressing our knowledge of what's really going on. Serving at Athena's temple could look like really a whole list of the modern things that make us feel like we're acceptable and safe in society. Maybe part of that is doing the pop analysis and the spiritualizing of bad situations while we're ignoring the body's signals that are like, hell no, I don't like this, get me out of here. Or it can be on a larger scale where segments of society commit to an external belief system that feels meaningful and gives a sense of protection and belonging. But again, it also requires conformity and suppression, and that can end up costing a lot. Again, there's different layers of the symbolism, the individual and the collective. When we look at the innermost one of the person's psyche, the collective one really ends up reflecting those same fears and needs. So the more extreme collective versions of Athena's temple would be perhaps high control religion and cults, where if you question the structure or say it hurt you, you get turned into a monster and banished. I hope you haven't experienced that, but it does exist. It does happen. And the reason that it does exist is because there are enough people in society who don't feel safe within themselves and are looking for a way to escape that through extreme structures. However, we personally escape to the temple, the unconscious will keep trying to pull us back through the body. And that could look like emotions that don't match the present. It could look like anxiety or even dreams. And sometimes it's pain in the body or mysterious illnesses. And meanwhile, we could be feeling these things, experiencing the pull to come back to our bodies. But we may also have loyalty to our versions of Athena's temple. And we want to maintain that structure of belief and self that we've built to avoid what was painful or frightening. So we can end up with this internal power struggle, right? Which we saw in the story. Medusa was pushing away those thoughts. She told herself her work at the temple was meaningful, even when it felt like it wasn't, that she's lucky to be there, even when it is quite unpleasant. And she and the other priestesses refuse to talk about what they all feel, that they're kind of being haunted by the god of the sea. At this point, we need to talk about Poseidon. Tuning into this symbolism makes all the difference, because if we took it literally and we're like, okay, he's a predator and he's part of our psyche, that would not be helpful. Every aspect of the psyche has a purpose and it wants what's best for us, even when it shows up in ways that are overall not helpful. So if you watched the story video, you already know that Poseidon is also known as Neptune and is the ruler of the unconscious. When we think about that, Neptune is the most distant known planet in the solar system, right? So it's hanging out on the edge of conscious awareness. And that correlates with Poseidon ruling the oceanic depths. So the ruler of the unconscious represents this rather mysterious part of our psyches that carries messages from beyond and below, bringing them into awareness. I realize that is it can be confusing, and we have to think on it for a while, perhaps to make sense of how that matches up with our experience. And that's okay, because it's kind of the feeling of Neptune, confusion. Often the dreamy fog, dreams in general, the mystical, perhaps psychic, otherworldly knowing. And this also involves watery energy. The sign of Pisces, the fish, is ruled by Neptune. So that stands for dissolving of boundaries and not knowing really where we begin and end. All that watery energy. So this is not predatory, again, like the literal interpretation would be, but it can be really overwhelming. And what we're really looking at right now in this very non-literal interpretation of Medusa's story is how the unconscious can overtake and overwhelm us, and things can wash up in our psyches from the depths of our ocean or the edges of our consciousness in ways that can leave us confused and like our boundaries have been washed away, and perhaps even like we're not willing participants in the events of our lives. And as we also saw in the story, messages from the unconscious don't usually come as rational thoughts, but they activate our bodies, our nervous systems, and they travel through our energetic pathways. So when our systems have been wired by traumatic events or long-term stress and the unconscious material comes up, we might be too overwhelmed to deal with it. Perhaps the emotional water washes us away, and at that point we might be fawning or lashing out or freezing or self-sabotaging in ways that we do not feel in control of. That is very, very common. So at this point, we have our maiden Medusa, and she's tried to escape what felt unsafe in the body by going to this mental structure of the temple. But the unconscious is like, no, you can't escape me. I'm everywhere. It's at this point in the story where the inner power struggle really becomes apparent. And this is where Athena comes in. It is her temple, right? She's there to defend it. And she is also really a product of a system that prioritizes power at all costs and turns the wisdom of the mother into a fly and swallows it, which is what Zeus did to Athena's mother. So Athena was born in full armor out of her father's skull. We see she identifies with the system she's born into and she gets her power from it. And it seems like she has a certain amount of contempt for the maiden Medusa and her vulnerability and perhaps her sensuality. And I think a lot of us really don't like seeing Athena this way, right? She's the goddess of wisdom, and we want more from her. I know some people reading about it have tried to make sense of her punishing Medusa so horrifically, that it's strategy or she just couldn't or whatever. I mean, it is just a story. But anyways, the culture that this story came from didn't have the wisdom of the Great Mother. So we have a little more compassion and balance now. We want her to show up as her best, but we have to remember too that there's always a shadow. So when we're looking at gods and goddess archetypes in these stories, they really represent the strongest, most unfiltered energy. So there's a potential for a really strong shadow to punch through. As much as there is for, the really strong good, there can be the really strong shadow. And that's what we see in this story. With Athena, the shadow of having wisdom is being judgmental, and the shadow of strategy is having a cold detachment that you frame as necessity. So, yeah, we don't like that Athena showed up that way, but she did. We have to look at how that can show up in each of us so that we can choose differently. And then we learn something from the story, right? As far as the archetypes again, instead of the kind, comforting, protective, great mother goddess that Medusa hopes to find, Athena shows up as what Jungian psychoanalyst Marion Woodman called the archetypal death mother, who would be the shadow of the great mother. And the energy that the death mother brings in words or otherwise conveys to the child that they are not supposed to be here, that they are unwanted, unlovable, unredeemable, or at least some part of them is. And really, it's the curse of toxic shame. It is paralyzing and it gets internalized in the body and it just drains your energy right out. If you felt toxic shame in your body, like it just like sucks the energy out and turns you to stone. And also on the mental level, the death mother voice gets internalized, and we often call her at that point the inner critic. So in the story, Athena projects this death mother archetype onto Medusa with her curse. You're obscene, you don't belong here, you're the monster. And hearing these words, Medusa, who is already shocked by Poseidon's assault, is slipping further into the paralyzation of the parasympathetic freeze. She can't speak, she's dissociating. That is used by Athena as further evidence against her. So poor Medusa internalizes Athena's death mother, and it takes over her body. It doesn't kill the maiden Medusa, it traps her inside this shameful form that is not her own. And maybe you've had that happen in some way, feeling like you're some kind of monster because of things someone else did to you, or the projections they made you carry, the beliefs about yourself and your body that they put on you. And when those kind of thoughts and beliefs and inner criticism is tied up with a body that has had to organize its entire way of being around trauma or long-term stress, it can get to the point where you really don't recognize your true nature anymore. It's like you're trapped inside a body that is no longer yours. And maybe it's gone on so long, you can't even remember who you were or to figure out who you might have been without the trauma responses. Sometimes it's easier to see how that curse was put upon us by someone else. Like we can pick it out, like, yes, that is when that happened to me. But it can be harder to recognize how we continue the cycle. And many of us have spent so much time in our versions of Athena's Temple of the Mind, and we've developed our intelligence and strategy, and we've gotten good at it so that we can hide the Death Mother shadow really well. But inside the temple, we let her keep going. She's attacking our maiden with the words we tell ourselves. She's shaming us. It's all your fault. You're the monster. It's something to contemplate. Where does that show up in us? Do we lash out at others with it, or do we turn it on ourselves? So this seems like a good point to talk about the snake hair. Historically, snakes symbolize knowledge, and sometimes they're the coiled life force energy that erupts suddenly. And really, we all carry some suppressed knowledge, things our souls know, our bodies know, but that the culture and conditioning have told us, no, that's wrong or dangerous or stupid. So we keep the knowledge buried in the unconscious in order to assimilate ourselves into the temples, into our family or society or our chosen belief system. So when an inconvenient truth washes up into our awareness, we kind of tend to try to shove it away, carry on. We know that as cognitive dissonance. So once Medusa experiences this assault by the unconscious Poseidon, she now knows something that is undeniable. She can't suppress that knowledge anymore, no matter how much she wants to, and she is actually pregnant with that reality. And that is a threat to the entire structure that Athena is trying to hold together. To me, the snakes coming out of Medusa's head are knowledge arising that most can't bear to look at. And Medusa has been forced to bring the reality of it to the surface. So if you have had some kind of rude awakening that challenged a belief system or a power structure, and you saw harm being done, but people didn't want to know what you saw, or they turned it back on you as if you were the monster for saying the true thing, that was the snake hair. I think when we have the snake hair arise, it's often an initiation point into a cycle of psychic death and rebirth. And it is generally a shocking transformation that is incredibly difficult, but eventually beautiful. So tell me in the comments if that resonates or if something else comes to your mind on that. The maiden Medusa is now trapped in this body. She's still in there somewhere, but is now unrecognizable even to herself. And she's having this dissociative reaction. The roar is coming out that she doesn't even recognize as her own. So the survival energy in her body has overrode her conscious control, and she doesn't know how to interrupt that. That is something in ourselves that we can learn to interrupt. But if you have a history of perhaps complex trauma, you probably know what that feels like. And I do too. And again, sometimes it can be directed at someone else, roaring at them, turning them to stone. But we're looking at the story again as taking place all inside one person. So we're looking at how does the monstrous seeming energy get turned inward? To examine that, we'll go back to the root of what the monster is. It's unmetabolized terror and toxic shame. So when those feelings are alive in us, it's paralyzing, right? It's like, well, if I stay small and still, I can survive. And so we collapse in our own energy to do that. In the story, the guards take Medusa to the island, and the one just wants to help. So he kindly cuts the ropes around her wrists so she can move. Unwittingly, she freaks out. She wants his help, but instead she ends up turning him to stone. And that's really what this internal survival struggle can feel like, when this kind of masculine energy wants to help us move forward and go after what we want, to build a better life for ourselves perhaps. But internalized, there's all this shame and terror. And our good-willed masculine energy has nothing on that primal survival energy. It will turn him to stone. And consciously, we have no idea what happened. We think, where did my energy go? Why am I so unmotivated? Why do I keep sabotaging myself? Why do I break promises to myself? And like in the story, the power struggle just continues to escalate. And again, we're in this very patriarchal culture that glorifies the masculine energy and tells us you should just be able to push through. If you just get your mental temple in order, then you can override the body. And we think if we try hard enough, if we just send enough of our masculine force, we can kill the Gorgon. But it doesn't work. because the Gorgon is there for a reason and she is protecting something important. That brings us to who I think is the most important two characters in the story. I think they're the ones humanity needs the most, Steno and Euryale. And it took me a minute to recognize them as I was writing this. Like, why are there two more Gorgons? Do I even need to write about them? Can I just skip them? Get done with this. So I don't Google this stuff, just so you know. I just kind of marinate in the story until I get it, and I did get it. Steno and Euryale are the immortal sisters who were born Gorgons, and they were always kept isolated. These two represent the feminine aspects of the soul that have never been allowed to exist in patriarchal culture. Whereas we see the maiden Medusa and her fellow priestesses, they are the feminine that is allowed as the beautiful object serving the structure. And they have the sensual, youthful, mortal energy that the patriarchy wants around in ways that can be contained and extracted. But Steno and Euryale are something else altogether, and their existence itself is a threat to every system of control. They are our mysticism and wildness, and they are depicted as immortal because they belong to the soul more than the body. And most of us learned to banish these parts very early and to fear even looking at them. So Steno and Euryale really are threats to the system because they provide direct connection to both spirit and matter. The mystic has the direct connection to wisdom outside of structured learning or religious beliefs. And the wild woman archetype can create and sustain life outside of controlled economies. You can see where the extractive power structures that be do not want that. And they definitely can't have all three of the sisters communicating, where Medusa and also the priestesses back at the temple realize they can bring change using the body's intuition and power. The gods weren't putting up with that, and the most powerful aspects of the feminine were banished. So the little line I put in the story where Steno says it would be 3,000 to 4,000 years before humanity was ready for the Gorgons. And I think we are about there, and it's time to bring them back because really they change everything. Speaking of change, let's go back to Medusa. We reached the point in her story where she knows things can't carry on. Something new is ready to be born, and her Gorgon body can't survive it. This is a very violent, brutal part of the story, and really it fits symbolically. It's really easy to talk about transformation and healing and to know all the language, but it's hard and maybe even rare for people to actually do it because something has to die, and that is the psychic death, as it's called, and it's never easy. It usually involves us looking at things about ourselves we don't want to see and letting go of ways of being and viewing things that at one time were our only option. But there comes a time when we know that it's time. There is only so long you can gestate transformation inside of you, and either that creative power will wither and poison you from the inside, or it will do what is necessary to be born. Often we come to the point of the psychic death because there is a breaking point that arises, and maybe that's a relationship breakdown or an illness or the loss of something like a community or career, some kind of betrayal or a pivotal soul entering your life and turning it upside down. So many ways that we could be plunged into facing the death of what was and who we thought we were. So to me, Perseus is the catalytic energy that arises during these times. And it does sometimes seem in retrospect like he was sent by the gods and equipped by them because we were in an unsustainable situation and not able to access the energy that we needed for transformation on our own. And that can be really hard to see when you're going through it, I know, but often when we get to the other side of something, it's like, yep, if I was even a little comfortable there, I was just going to stay put and not move. Perseus is depicted as the hero of the story, but to me, he's just a ray of masculine energy that comes when transformation is ready to be born. Really, though, the birth time only arrives because the maiden Medusa has learned the love and compassion of the mother, the one that Athena did not know, the one that the patriarchal system swallowed. So, in addition to the Gorgon's mysticism and wildness, this great mother energy is the one that we really need. Really, the whole world has a mother wound at this point, but we're working on finding her, and it starts from within. So, Medusa's not so little babies are born. There's Pegasus, the winged horse, and really, I don't think anything can embody transcendence more than that image of Pegasus. And then we have Chrysor, this gigantic warrior. Really, there's all that suppressed energy, all the times that the maiden couldn't fight back or speak up, finding its way as a noble, masculine, protective power. And then there are the vials of Medusa's blood. One medicine, one poison. We end up finding the medicine in our wounds and using it to help others. And also, our earned wisdom can really be used selectively as poison to speak out against evil. At the end of the story, we have this kind of grotesque point. Not kind of, it's really grotesque. Perseus uses the head of Medusa on Athena's shield to rescue Princess Andromeda. And then they go on to get married, which I didn't put in the story, but so this could be viewed as the maiden archetype again, showing up in the psyche and having another opportunity to live in harmony with the masculine energy, to have a life where she only has to visit the temple. She doesn't have to live or serve there. And she gets to become a queen. Even though that seems like kind of a footnote to Medusa's story, I do think it is important because, like Riley said, you must hold on to hope, even when it's easier said than done. Whatever you've been through or going through, wherever you are in the arc of this story right now, there's always the possibility of rebirth, of experiencing something entirely new. So that is my take on the story's symbolism, and everyone is going to look at an archetypal story like this through the lens of their own experience. If you have thoughts and your own wisdom to share, drop them in the comments. I would love to hear from you. And I hope you will stick around and subscribe for more stories and symbolism, including completely original human-written archetypal stories. So thank you for being here.